Hello, my name is Henry Cable, and today me and Mark, Julian, and Siam will be presenting determinants of education regarding those identifying as conservative or liberal in the United States. George Washington Carver once said, "Education is the key that unlocks the golden door to freedom," and Malcolm X stated, "Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today." To all the influential people in this world that have made education as a goal to improve people in society are the ones that will forever be in our debt. There is no question of whether one's external variables will affect their likelihood to attain secondary education. However, some of the variables that will influence one's pursuance of college are often unclear. Sure, a person coming from a wealthy family will be more likely to go to college, right? Perhaps not. And perhaps there are even more seemingly random factors that could influence an individual's decision to go back to school, such as the number of siblings they have, their marital status, or even their political stance. This project aims to observe those variables, among others, and see exactly if and by how much they will impact a person's years of schooling. This study is important because if we can determine the reasons why some groups of people are lacking in years of education, we can implement policy improvements to help accommodate those who are disadvantaged, leading to an overall better educated society. A better educated society leads to higher output, an improved economy, and higher quality of life for the benefit of the entire nation. This project will examine a data set that was obtained from the General Social Survey database for the project of the Nonpartisan and Objective Research Organization at the University of Chicago. We will begin by laying out the several variables that we will be testing as well as predicting the expected signs of them as they relate to the dependent variable. In the next section, we'll produce the descriptive statistics for the dataset and interpret the findings. Following that will be the empirical results section, where we'll utilize several models to gain deeper insight into how our variables affect one's years of education. Finally, we will conclude the project with a section to summarize our findings, discuss the limitations of our study, and make a policy recommendation to remedy the issues we have found. There's two pieces of literature we're going to be reviewing. The first one is titled "Social and Economic Returns to College Education in the United States" by Michael Hout. This article by Michael Hout explains the benefits of secondary education in the United States. Besides the obvious benefit of improving one's intelligence, it considers some of the less obvious benefits that college graduates realize. For example, the author notes how college graduates are more likely to live a more stable family life, have improved health, live a longer life, and commit less crimes. He supports his findings with numerous charts and data providing the significance of a college education as it pertains to such factors. He continues his study by expanding his scope beyond an individual level. He cites the benefit of a college education to the United States at large. Of several benefits, his most notable observations were that a better educated population results in less crime, a lower divorce rate, and increased civic life participation, among other important gains. In fact, he notes that some findings actually imply that the social gains exceed the private returns. This article is important to our study because it further emphasizes the why when it comes to gaining insight on years of education. As previously mentioned, discovering what sort of factors affect one's education can give policymakers a direction when it comes to increasing the nation's human capital and thereby quality of life. The next piece of literature is Ethnic Minority Educational Success: Understanding Accomplishments in Challenging Settings by Jennifer Engel. In this article, the author goes into detail about how first-generation college students are at a disadvantage when it comes to obtaining a college degree. Similar to our study, She examines the challenges individuals may face when deciding on pursuing a secondary education. Engel also spends time discussing the factors that will affect success in college, such as social/academic integration. This ties into our paper because it speaks to the impact of a variable that may not instantly come to mind when trying to decide what groups of people are being subject to less than equitable opportunities for educational success. Moreover, a key takeaway from this article is that it suggests some of the possible creative solutions to remedy the issue. Namely, she suggests increasing financial access, planning college early on or improving college preparation, easing the transition to college, and engaging potential students with the college environment.
So we're going to be moving on to the next part of our presentation, which is going to be the model that we created and that we're going to be working with. Now, what we're trying to figure out with this model, with this regression model, is to essentially analyze the relationship between the dependent and independent variables. We're trying to basically predict the years of schooling that any given individual is going to require, and we're going to use the independent variables in this model to reach that goal. We're obviously in this report trying to focus specifically on conservative and liberal ideology as a determinant towards education and years of schooling, but you obviously can't build a model out of that alone. You have to have other independent variables, other control variables in a sense, that'll help us reach that goal and kind of like flesh out what we're trying to do. And that's essentially what we've done with the model right here. We're going to be using our independent variables of white, female, educ mother, educ father, SIBS, married, conservative, and liberal. And I'm going to go into detail about what these variables consist of. So first, we're going to talk about our dependent variable, which is just instated as educ. Essentially, the definition of this one is the number of years of schooling for the specific individual. And this is, of course, what we're trying to predict. We're trying to see how many years this person is going to attend school, whether they go to high school, whether they attend a higher institution or go even further to graduate school. That's something that we're trying to figure out with the data that we are given. Of course, because it is the dependent variable, there is no expected sign. Now, moving on to our independent variables, we're going to move on to white, which is a binary variable, a dummy variable, where it is 1, the value of 1 if the individual is white, and 0 if otherwise. Now, we think that this variable is likely going to be positive because white people are typically more affluent, they have more mainstay in the United States where our data is focused on. This is a variable that is very in tune with the status quo. The white people in society tend to be the most successful and the most prominent. And with this in mind, if the value is 1, it is likely that they've been attending school for longer. The next independent variable is female, where it's another binary variable where the value is 1 if the individual identifies as female and 0 if otherwise. The expected sign for this one is also going to be positive because we think with the gender wage gap and with the trend towards third wave feminism, there are more women attending higher education than ever before. And with this in mind, women have come into higher education, higher institutions at very, very high rates. This is something that's been happening for the past few decades, and I believe it has continued to increase even today. The next independent variable, is going to be educ mother, which is education mother. It's the number of years of schooling for the individual's mother. We also have educ father, which is the number of years of schooling for the individual's father. So this variable is essentially the dependent variable, but it is not focused on the individual, but rather the parents of the individual. Both of these signs are almost certainly going to be positive. That is because these parents already essentially have a mainstay in education. They're already people who have dealt with education. If the value for these independent variables are higher, they're going to likely have more income, more resources, more knowledge about education, and are thus able to spread that to their children. They're going to be able to help their children with college applications. They're going to be able to fund things like private school. It is just something that is going to ultimately assist the individual in the long run if the value is higher. The next variable is SIBS, which is short for siblings. It is the number of the individual siblings, and we think this one is actually going to be negative. Now, I think this one is going to be negative because the more siblings you have is typically going to divvy up the available resources for the individual and their family. If you have, say, 5 siblings compared to having one sibling or being an only child, the parents can only make so much. Their income is likely going to stay the same whether they have 10 kids or 1 kid. They have to fund all of these children. And if all of these children are promising students, they're not going to be able to still effectively help all of them compared to, say, helping just one child. There is also a case to be made that typically it is poorer families that are having more children. This might be more of a phenomenon outside the United States, whereas the data is focused inside the United States. But I think it is something to note and something to take into account when predicting that, yeah, we think the sibling variable is likely going to have a negative sign. The next independent variable is probably the most contentious. I think this variable is likely to go either way, and if we get it wrong, we'll likely be close. It is the married independent variable. It's another binary variable. It's the value of 1 if the individual is married or in a domestic partnership, and 0 if otherwise. We ultimately think this one is going to be negative. And we think so because married, I believe the arguments for having married as positive is that it might indicate more financial success, it might be the ability to secure more years of education, but it is also possible that being married might be an incentive away from continuing education, especially for women. When women are put into that role of a marriage or a domestic partnership, they might be stuck at home with a child, or they might have other things to worry about. They might establish themselves as a single earner household. Maybe it is the traditional household role. That is something that society has tried to stray away from, but it is something that is incredibly prevalent in modern society. And I don't think that is something that we can ignore. And I think because of those reasons, this variable might end up negative. The last 2 independent variables are going to be our final independent variables, and those are conservative and liberal, the focus of this term paper. So with conservative and liberal, these are both binary variables. Conservative is 1 if the individual identifies as a conservative, 0 if otherwise, and liberal is 1 if the individual identifies as liberal, and 0 if otherwise. Now, it is important to note that these are not polar opposites. You don't have to be a conservative or a liberal. It is possible that you strike as neither. I don't believe it is possible that you can be both, but it is possible that you can be neither. And that's why they are 2 separate variables as compared to just having a dummy variable for liberal. We think conservative is going to be negative. And we think it's going to be negative because it has become more popular over time that colleges and universities are seen as very liberal, progressive institutions. They are seen as somewhat elitist groups, despite the fact that they have gotten more popular. And this might be just recency bias, but I think there is a big trend among conservative people, Republicans, that college is basically just a drain on resources, on the economy, and so on. I think because of that, it will likely be negative, but I think there is some room for it to be positive. The other independent variable is going to be positive for the opposite reasons. Liberal is likely going to be positive because liberals are likely more incentivized to actually want to go to college. They're going to want to stay in school a little more. They are also likely going to be richer, which we talked about earlier, that will likely help them out. You usually see people at the top of the income spectrum are likely to be conservative, but you see a lot of the upper middle class is likely to be liberal. What was I saying? Yes, they're people who go to college and so on are likely to earn more. And so, yeah.
Hi, my name is Simon Schleining, and I'm going to be going over some of the data and descriptive statistics results from our model. Now, when looking at our table, one of the first things that sticks out to me is you can see that the average years of education for the current population and the sample size far exceeds the average years of education for their mothers and fathers. The average year of the current sample size is 14.45 years, whereas the mother and fathers are 12.2 and 12.3 years respectively. We believe that a lot of this gap in the raising of the average amount of years is largely attributed to the compounding intergenerational gains that the previous generation had started to invest in by going to school longer. Going to school increases income, it increases productivity, and it increases opportunities in the workplace for individuals in our society. By them doing more schooling, it increased their opportunities, grew their income, and allowed them to give an increased abundance of all the aforementioned to the next generation, which over time has raised that average. Furthermore, by more and more people becoming educated and having those increased opportunities, you're going to see increased competition in the marketplace for workers and employees. What this does is then raise the standard or the minimum level of qualifications for each marginal worker, which then will raise the average years of education for each worker. Another thing to look at within this model and within these initial results is you can see that there's a large variation in the range of siblings, astronomically compared to the other variables in the model. The average number of siblings came out to around 3.2 siblings per family. The minimum of that is 0 with an only child, and the max is 32. As you can see, with a maximum of 32 siblings, it's beyond your reasonable and average size family. That being said, we believe that with this current sample, this may pose as initial and early on evidence that there are severe outliers in the study who may skew the sibling data. Furthermore, that it's all recorded in the same geographic location, it is possible that some of these members of very large families, say 32 siblings, may have multiple members of those siblings who have been included in participants in the same study. That will only further compound the skewing of the data that you're going to have multiple people reporting 32 siblings and then their years of education, et cetera, which will compound off of our initial expectation that siblings will be a negative coefficient. Another thing to look at from these initial results is that most of our sample participants were primarily white. So you can see that white was one of our dummy variables with value of 0 or 1. The average was 0.81, meaning that approximately 81% of our sample size was white. Another thing to look at was the majority of the participants were married. So if you look again at that coefficient or that average, you can see that with this dummy variable, the average was 0.672, or about a 67.2% of the sample size were married in this case. Now moving on to our correlation coefficients, you can see that I've highlighted the first column of results, since that is the education column and that is our dependent variable. Now looking at those findings, one of the first things you can see is that the years of education of a father and mother do have a positive correlation on the years of education for the new generation or that current sample that we are studying. This is in line with and consistent with our initial expectations that the compounding effect of having parents or previous generation who put in more time for school will have a positive impact on future generations. In this case, coefficient for mother and father was 0.42 and 0.45, which are relatively strong in the scheme of things on their effect of years of education for the next generation. Another interesting thing to look at in part of our study was you can see that, like Julian alluded to earlier, the liberal identification or the liberal ideology has 4 times the positive correlation to years of education as opposed to conservative. Where this strays from our initial expectations is the conservatives also had a positive correlation to years of education, just about 4 times less so than the liberal. You can see through this model that the coefficient for conservative was 0.0263, or about a 2.5% effect, and you can see with liberal it was 0.1151. So what this shows is that people who have political identity are more likely to go to school for more years. However, the impact of having a liberal political identity as opposed to a conservative will give you a greater positive impact. We believe this can be due to a number of factors, but even just having an investment at a young age into political belief system shows an engagement and a willingness to learn. And we believe that this will then show up in their years of education. Also, with what Julian alluded to, the growth or the larger amount of liberals going to college as opposed to conservatives can be viewed from the narrative that colleges at this point are very liberal institutions. We do not have enough data at this time to verify that that notion is normative or positive. However, it is a factor that we believe helps lead into this, or at least it can't be disproven at this point. Another interesting part to look at out of this correlation matrix is you can see that the number of siblings do in fact have a negative correlation, and a very strong one at that. Each additional sibling should reduce the amount of years of education by about 0.265. Now keep in mind, as we saw in the initial summary statistics, there is a large standard deviation in siblings, which could be skewed from outliers in larger families. However, it does show that a dissipation of resources and more siblings from the parents will decrease their odds of going to continuing education or having more years of education. It's very logical that a family that has a few head earners or has more dependents will have more of a financial outlay to take care of the day-to-day operations and less to spend on continuing education, thereby decreasing the opportunity or increasing the risk factor of one of those children going to college or going to further education. Another good correlation to look at here, another good coefficient, is that being female and being white both have a positive correlation. So as we're testing a bunch of these different determinants of whether or not they're going to school, you can see that being a woman and being white have a positive correlation with going to school for longer. Now finally, on this last table, you can see our horizontal bar graph that compares each political ideology, including an independent, with the amount of years of education that they will attain. Furthermore, it's then divided into married and non-married subgroups. One of the first things I noticed is marriage is a positive determinant of education years for current generation, but opposite for the previous generation. So you can see if the previous generation, or the mothers and fathers tested in this example, if they were to be married, the odds that they went to school, it decreases their odds of going to school longer, as opposed to the unmarried subset of that older generation who would go to school for longer. The opposite is true for the current generation. The unmarried have more education as opposed to the married. We believe that this is largely due to the fact of different economic situations of the previous generation as opposed to now. To go to school for longer, you can't have as much of a financial obligation or as many dependents in the current generation, which would lead the unmarried group, regardless of ideology, to have more years of education just from the extra disposable income they're willing to risk and to spend on the endeavor. Whereas in the previous generation, if they were to be married, odds are that they did not need the same amount of outlay to go, or they didn't have the same cost of living and therefore did not need the same amount of education to achieve the same relative level of income that the current generation does. Finally, one of the parts to look at on this graph is the years of education have steadily increased across all political ideologies. So you can see that our initial assumption that the increasing competition in the workplace, regardless of ideology or belief system, is forcing more and more individuals to gain a higher level of education to compete and to have a chance to work. And so all these except for the conservative estimate are in line with our expectations and are in line with our initial thoughts. So going forward, we will use the regression to see how much each of these impacts truly affected the model and how much were just correlation and not causation.
Hello, I'm here to present the empirical results of the regression models that we did for our conservative versus liberal education prediction. These regression results do paint a good picture of the differences in education and how these determinants influence the education level of individuals. For the first regression of variables, you see that the liberal indicator variable shows that education will be about 0.29 months of education higher for those that are liberal compared to those that are conservative. The significance of these variables are less than 0.01, so they are statistically significant. Also, being a female will have an increase of 0.322 in education compared to male counterparts, and is statistically significant as well. It's also interesting to see that if someone is married, they will have around 6 months increase in education, and it can be inferred that married people are likely to have more education to support their family. When controlling for the indicator variables of liberal and conservative, there are some similarities in increase or decrease of education. As you can see, for the liberal, the female variables roughly is about 0.46 years of education versus 0.146 for conservative. Now, the conservative version is not statistically significant, but the liberal one is, and is actually a pretty good magnitude. When you look at the education of the parents of the mother and father, you can see that the magnitudes for liberal are a lot larger as compared to conservative. The conservative is about less than 0.2, and then the liberal is closer to 0.2 and over 0.2. So that's roughly about 2 months. That's 4 months of education difference. As for siblings, it's known that the more siblings you have, the decrease in education that you'll have because of other determining factors like price of education, ability to go to school, and other factors that are unknown. And you can see also with the married variable that about 6 months increase in education versus almost 6 months for the conservative. Now, when you look at the all variable model, you can see that roughly liberal, if you're a liberal, you have about 10 months more education versus a conservative, which has about 6 months of education. When you look at the averages, though, for the intercepts for the actual education, you can see that liberals are 9.5 months of education, 9.5 years of education, and then for conservative is about 10 years education. Now, if you look at those, you can see that the conservative may look like they have more education than the liberal, but if you look at the magnitude of the coefficients for the different variables, you can see that the magnitudes are a lot larger for liberal and conservative are a lot less, which is quite interesting. The model only shows about 25%, 22% of the variation in the model, but it is statistically significant model with F values being below 0.01. The data is limited. It's about a third of the data is conservative, a third of the data does not identify as conservative or liberal, and about 26% are liberal. So more data would probably be needed to actually round this out and get more precise data. In addition, the data seems to be more of a indication that in the 2000s and 2016, the No Child Left Behind Act could have manipulated or caused some issues with getting accurate results for education because you can't really measure for the quality of education. And that's all I have, and then we're on to the next part. Thank you.
Our study was successful in providing useful information regarding the factors that influence one's years of education. Not only did we explore common explanatory variables, such as a person's gender or race, but we were even able to draw conclusions on how one's political stance affects their education. Following the model section, we produced several tables that showed the average values of our observed variables. We also inserted a correlation matrix with accompanying graphs to clearly illustrate our findings. Some of the key findings were that being liberal had a higher positive correlation with years of education, being white is positively correlated with years of education, and better educated parents were highly impactful on the years of education in their child. The results were mostly consistent with our estimations, with the exception of the married and conservative variables, which did not show a negative correlation as we'd expected. In the empirical results section, we displayed the regression results to further explain the data. We found that all of the observed variables are statistically significant in determining years of education. Some of the more notable findings were that married individuals are more likely to have more education, and that one's gender is significant in determining education for conservatives, but not so much for liberals. Some limitations do exist with the study. A way to expand it would be to collect a nationwide sample and control for these variables on a state-by-state basis. Also, a more updated data set would be more useful as the perceived importance of secondary education seems to change on a fairly regular basis. Lastly, a similar report could control for the differences seen in urban environments compared to rural ones, as individuals in those respective categories may have different priorities. Based on our findings, we would recommend a policy that places higher focus on educational attainment for those who are disadvantaged. As mentioned in the article by Jennifer Engel, some of the methods that can be used to achieve this are increasing a student's access to financial aid, promoting college at an earlier age, and increasing exposure and engagement to the college environment. This will conclude our presentation. Thank you very much.